Hello and welcome everyone to this two-part series on effective communications with colleagues and strategies for resolving conflict. Now, this is a two-part series, so part one, uh, it's a two-part webinar. So part one, we're going to cover today in this session, effective communications with colleagues, and part two, we're going to cover at a later date. But I will be your host for both of them. My name is Dr. Dustin Kieschnick. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist and a VMHS facilitator. Now, before we dive into the conflict or the conflict, the content, um, I want to mention that this webinar is generously sponsored by Not One More Vet by NOMV. And to just talk a little bit more about my background and how and the role that I play here, I've been a VMHS facilitator for over 5 years. I also serve as a assistant clinical professor at UCSF at the University of California, San Francisco. And before that, I spent 9 years in the Marines and I'm a United States Marine Corps veteran. So, what are we hoping to accomplish today? Well, for one, we're hoping that you acquire greater skills when engaging in difficult conversations with clients and colleagues. We're hoping that this increases confidence in maintaining healthy boundaries. We're also hoping that you are able to understand a framework with which to resolve conflict and to take the perspective of a growth mindset when navigating difficult conversations. And overall, we hope that this decreases your day to day stress. So, as we begin, there are some questions we want to consider. And and in considering these, maybe think back to a recent experience that was a difficult conversation or some sort of conflict or just a high intensity conversation. And how and think about how you tend to respond to conflict at work. We're really thinking here in terms of identifying our action tendencies. What is it that we normally go to when we're in this type of situation? We also want to consider, what are we thinking in the moment? What are the thoughts that come to us? What are the feelings that arise? And what are the actions that we take? What do we do? And we take all that together and we also want to try and identify maybe our conflict style. So if we put it to a 2 by 2 graph with assertiveness on the y-axis and cooperativeness on the x-axis, we have different styles that are positioned, at different places across this graph. So let's first look at competing, which is both is assertive but also uncooperative. So it's high in assertiveness, it's low in cooperativeness. And so this is where an individual pursues his or her own concerns at the other person's expense. Let's also consider accommodating, which is unassertive and cooperative. So it's high on cooperativeness, but low on assertiveness. This is the complete opposite of competing. Next, we go into avoiding, which is both unassertive and uncooperative. So, this is where the person neither pursues his or her own concerns nor those of the other individual. This type of person tends to want to get away from the conflict as fast as possible. And then we also have collaborating, which is both assertive and cooperative. It's in the upper right hand corner here. So it's high on assertiveness, high on cooperativeness. It's the complete opposite of avoiding. And lastly, we have compromising, which is moderate in both assertiveness and cooperativeness. Now, there's not necessarily any right or wrong to which style we might be, where we tend to fall on this graph, but there may be different styles that are less suited to different types of situations, right? We also like the idea of maybe, us being more often in a collaborating or a compromising style, whereas maybe we tend to be in a more accommodating or avoiding style. Knowing how you tend to respond is the biggest and most important part of this, because by knowing what our style tends to be, it allows us the choice to decide which style might be more helpful in a given situation. So, there's also some effective communication skills that we would just want to learn as a baseline, right? These are going to be the everyday, the day-to-day skills that you put into place and put into practice. And these actually go a long way to preventing high intensity, high conflict, difficult conversations. They really set the stage for a an overall good communication environment. And so one of those is providing encouraging feedback. A valuable way to share feedback is to restate what you heard the other person say. And what that might look like is, what I hear you saying is this. Because we all appreciate how fulfilling it feels to be heard. And when we have somebody repeat their interpretation of what we're saying, it feels there's a part of it that can feel good. And so while we don't necessarily have to agree with what's being said, we want to show that we're considering the other person's perspective to the best of our ability. And what that might look like is, I understand you're looking at this situation in this way, and I'm maybe looking at it from a different perspective, right? But even so, even if we identify the difference, we're still making room for, I this is what I understand about your perspective, and by doing so, I value that it's your perspective. I value that this is how you think about it. Another good skill, which is sounds really easy and often is much more difficult in practice, especially in high intensity situations, is asking open-ended questions. So we're all guilty of asking rhetorical questions, but this type of interrogation rarely prompts fruitful discussions. So often rhetorical questions are us really asking questions to really illustrate our own point, or to project on the other person the perspective that we want them to have. And we often continue in this way, and we continue in this manner because it does serve the purpose of helping us release our own frustration and anger, even though we recognize that it's harmful to our goal of reaching resolution, or that it could be harmful to our goal of reaching a resolution. So try asking open-ended questions instead when you have concerns. And an example of this might say, I could use more help with such and such. Do you have any ideas for how we can accomplish this? Or even saying, I really am interested in where you're coming from. Can you tell me a little bit more about your perspective? Another really, really good technique is the use of I plus XYZ statements. Now, you may have heard that using I statements when you're communicating that I feel, I need, I want, it allows you to take ownership of your own feelings. But the next step is we want to try adding the XYZ technique. So, what that looks like is I feel X when you do Y in situation Z. And an example of this could be I feel upset, I feel angry when you disregard me or you talk over me in front of clients, right? This provides useful context to the other person about what we're thinking and how we're feeling. But perhaps more importantly, it keeps the discussion contained to the specific situation. When we say I feel X, we're being very specific about the thing that we're feeling. When we talk about why, we're being the why, um, we're being very specific about what the behavior is that we're seeing. And when we talk about Z, we're being very specific about the situation in which it occurs. A lot of times people get tend to get defensive when they feel like what's being said is a global critique or a global criticism of their character. And so instead of saying that it happens and this is the behavior in this situation, it gets interpreted as a more global, like you always, or you are this, like you're a person that runs over people, like you're a person that doesn't let people talk, right? That's a very, very global attribution. And by doing this, we really say, like, we give the opportunity to say it's really relegated to this situation. Because when we start to use the words always or never, you always do this, you never do this, it automatically invokes a defensiveness. And so it also keeps us from bringing in multiple variables, which can cause confusion about the topic at hand. Because we've all been in this type of discussion or type of conflict or type of dialogue where we start bringing in all the other situations. We start bringing in history. We start talking about all the other ways in which we're feeling about something, and it can make what we're talking about very convoluted. And I might be talking now about one thing, you're responding to another thing, and then we're completely off on not on the same page. This one is a often overlooked and surprisingly powerful skill or tool, and that's generously sharing appreciations. So, in the healthiest workplace interactions, each party feels valued and respected for who they are and the role that they play. So, try identifying what you appreciate about the other person and share these qualities with them. Right? This can even take place when when you're identifying differences. So for a client, it might be, I can see how much you really care about your pet, right? Or with a colleague, it might be, I can see how you have a really, really strong opinion, or you have a really, really strong idea for how you want to go about this. And I really admire that, right? It sets the stage and it sets the footing for us to be able to then have delve into the more difficult part of the conversation, because we also then acknowledge that there's some appreciation there at least too. So what do we do when communications break down or they head in the wrong direction? Now, if we if we look to understand communication breakdowns, it's often helpful to go back to the game tape, go back to a situation where something happened, and we can start to dive into it and dissect it and figure out, one, what's happening, but also what are some additional strategies that we can draw on. So if you think of a recent conversation, difficult conversation that was perhaps distressing, hopefully not too distressing, and if it is, that maybe pick something that's not that doesn't evoke so much. But think back, play out the scenario in your mind. What were the emotions that were coming to you? What were the thoughts that you had? What were the thoughts that came up? What were the perspectives and beliefs that you had, either about yourself or the other person? And what were the expectations that you had in that conversation? So now we're going to apply this, admittedly, an eye chart, but this really is a very, very valuable graph, and it's a really good illustration of what happens both cognitively and behaviorally, but also physiologically. And so let's start with the action tendency, the behavior. This is the thing that we see in others. And this might be something like defensiveness. We tend to notice defensiveness really, really quickly, really easily. Well, once we see that defensiveness, we have our own perception and attributions that come up. and we have our own emotions that are attached to it. And then we respond in kind. And that can evoke the same or different perceptions or attributions in the other person, which are also attached to emotions. But the thing that's driving most of this is all underneath the surface. It's our primary emotions and our unmet needs and fears, right? So, what I mean by primary emotions is that these are often the more vulnerable emotions that we have. It's being hurt, being sad. And the secondary emotions are the emotions that really have a more protective purpose. So if we're sad, if our primary emotion is sad, it might show up as anger so we can protect ourselves. If we feel hurt, it might show up as defensiveness, right? So it's like it's our way of protecting our vulnerability because when we're you know when we're in these conflict situations, our physiology tells us, "Hey, you're in danger, 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 danger." Your autonomic nervous system activates. You're in fight or flight, right? And when you're in fight or flight, you don't feel safe. And when you don't feel safe, you can't you can't allow vulnerable emotions to to be present, right? You have to protect them. So what this is about is really when we see an action tendency or a behavior that we also have differing perspectives and we have alternative ways of thinking about it, and then we have alternative ways of responding, which hopefully you know causes or the effect of which is the same in the other person. It's a de-escalation cycle, so that once we're more in tune, once we can understand why the why and the how for others, then we can meet them. Now, admittedly, there's so much more I can say about this graph, but do some you know, take a picture of it, go over it a little bit. It does sometimes take a little bit to just sort of click, um, but if we think about then growth mindset for conflict resolution, and it's really about asking ourselves a few questions. And the first one is, do I even want to resolve this conflict? I may not. Another one is, do I value or want a working relationship with this person? I may not, and that's okay. But knowing this also then sets the stage for how we resolve or don't resolve the conflict. And then if if we do want to resolve the conflict, if the working relationship is important, then what's our goal or vision, our expectation of resolution? Then when we think about that, we have to say, do I want this person to change completely? Or do I just want their specific behavior to be different? Those are two different approaches. And then we ask, am I willing to approach with a different mindset, a belief that things can change? And am I willing to decide whether I want to be right or to have a resolution? Do I want to be right or do I want to have the relationship? You can't always have both. And if I'm not willing to approach differently, do I accept? Most importantly, do I accept that the conflict cycle will likely not change? So, when we think about attempting to resolve the conflict, the timing is important. Do we do it in the moment? Do we do it sometime afterward? If we go back to our prior slide, do I even need to address it? Can I personally just let it go? How should I choose my battles? Is this a battle that I should choose? And we don't necessarily need to think of it in terms of as a battle, because we're really trying to work towards a mutual resolution. But then, if we think about resolving the conflict, what are the consequences of leaving it unaddressed? Because those might be real too. And even it's something that's not personally important to you, if you can let it go, if the consequences of leaving unaddressed outweigh the consequences of trying to address it, then that tells you something. So this is one of my favorite concepts, and it ties back to the graph that we had, the EFT cycle, in that when we see other people's behaviors, when we see how how they respond in different situations, we also want to be able to see what's underneath, or at least try to identify what's underneath. Because we frequently label behavior by what we observe or by how it makes us feel. But if we look underneath the surface, if we put our trauma glasses on, we can often find various reasons that people behave the way they do. And this can help us figure out how to respond in a constructive way. It gives us a chance to hear and respond with empathy. So, an example of this is that if we see somebody who we think is being manipulative, if we put our trauma glasses on, we might see them getting their needs met in ways that have worked in the past. Maybe it's the only thing that they feel has worked in the past. And they may just be doing whatever's necessary to survive. If we see somebody that we think might be lazy, they could just be overwhelmed, and they could just be lacking the skills to make decisions about what to do first or how to organize. If we see somebody that's resistant, they may be mistrustful due to a history of being hurt by others. And they may be scared to make progress and then thinking that they'll lose everything. If we see somebody who's unmotivated, they might just be depressed or fearful or overwhelmed or just frozen or paralyzed. Somebody that's disrespectful, they might just be feeling threatened, unsafe, or out of control. And if we see somebody who's attention seeking, they might just feel disconnected, alone, or unheard by others. So we talked a lot throughout this about identifying the behavior and identifying the emotion, being more aware of what our tendencies are. Because often emotions do become the driver in conflict at the expense of turning off the more logical or rational side of us. It's important to be able to identify and label the emotion so that we, one, know what it's telling us, and two, so that we know how to respond. If the emotional side and the rational side, so if we, before I go there, we have this concept in dialectical behavioral therapy of the emotional mind and the reasonable or the logic mind, right? When we're led too much by emotion, it may lead us into consequences or behaviors that we might regret or we might want to do differently. If we operate just from the logical side, the reasonable side, we might be devoid of emotion and be detached from the thing that actually makes life worth living. The idea is that by just operating in the logic mind, kind of become robots, and that's not really the we want to be able to operate from our wise mind. It's the overlap. It's being informed by our emotions, but also being able to think rationally and logically. We use the two to pick the wisest course forward. So it's informed by emotions, but balanced with rationality. Now, I hope that this um, this presentation has been this webinar has been helpful. Um, we went over uh, some basic skills, some basic tools to use in everyday practice. We went over some resolution strategies, and really those strategies are about our self-awareness and being about what tends to happen, how to identify the the action tendency that we have, how do we tend to respond, and what is typically our style for doing so. Do we avoid? Do we try to over accommodate? Do we try to compete? Right? And so by learning that, by becoming more familiar, we then start to have the ability to choose the way in which we want to go about it. We choose the style, we choose the tool, we choose the way of going about it that's most helpful for the situation. Now, uh, we want to encourage you to visit NOMV's website to learn more about not just communication strategies, but things that are inherently related to mental health and vet med. And so NOMV curates a variety of resources for support staff that can be found on our site at NOMV Resources. There are also informative webinars, hopefully like this one, that can be found on Not One More Vet's YouTube page. Additionally, Navi's Lifeboat program provides anonymous peer support for veterinary professionals. And Clear Blueprint is a workplace well-being program. NOMV's list is a database of peer submitted resources. And we also offer support grants for individuals and emergency grants for clinics. And so find more information by clicking on this if you have access to the slides to click on that. Now, please don't hesitate to let me know if you have any questions. Reach out to us at VMHS at nomv.org. We'd love to be able to answer your questions. We know that conflict in the workplace, and whether it's with colleagues, whether it's with clients, is such a big issue. And so often folks just feel ill-equipped to be able to hand or navigate the situation and feel like it's being navigated effectively, not through lack of skill, not through lack of will, but when we're in such a high intensity environment, we don't necessarily have those skills that readily come to us. And so we want to be able um, to give that to you and allow that to come forward. So here's some of our sources that we used in developing the content for these slides. Um, and so please feel free to take a picture if you like. We draw on we draw on evidence-based resources in the development of our material. We draw on evidence-based um, from our facilitators, their practice knowledge base, and we draw from um, our the folks that engage with NOMV, learning and understanding and continuing to adapt. So thank you all so much for your time and being here. I will see you next time when we go over part two, when we talk about strategies for resolving conflict. Thanks so much.